It turns out that the Lord is the one that gave to his people the Jewish feasts. And you know the great verse, Deuteronomy 16:16, in one verse where he talks about the 3 times a year that the people would gather together at the temple for the Passover and the Pentecost and the tabernacles. And then in Leviticus 23, he spells out all the various feasts, and they were times of great fellowship, rejoicing, praise, worship, historically. Spiritually, God desires for his children to gather together before him with thanksgiving and praise. We're doing that tonight. And doctrinally, the Lord used these feasts as kind of like a prophetic picture of various timetables of things he was going to do. And the Passover was the time of the offering of the Lamb of God. And it's a picture of what Christ would be, the Lamb of God, take away the sin of the world. He did it at Passover. The Pentecost was the picture of the coming of the Holy Spirit. And at Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came onto the people that were believers, and the church was publicly birthed outwardly in Acts 2. The tabernacles represented the coming of Christ in his birth. And, you know, we understand that Christ was born at tabernacles around September. And, you know, we've done the studies before that Mary probably conceived like December 24th or December 25th. That's probably when the father said, okay, son, it's time to go climb inside that womb, and 9 months later you'll be born. And so that's why God, in a wink, wink, allows us to celebrate what people think is a physical birth, but we know it's the spiritual conception of Mary. And so we celebrate the spiritual where they celebrate what they think is the physical, and the physical is less than the spiritual. And it's not only the coming of Christ that his birth was at Tabernacles, but that's when he's going to come back for his people in the book of Zechariah. He's going to show up on one of those days of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is about 8 days long. That's why he told them, you can't know the day or the hour, because I could pick any one of those 8 days to come. And so we're looking at this now. The way God let those feasts be, if you wanted to go back and study, we don't have time. You can go look at the old studies. He began with the first month, where he had the Passover and unleavened bread and was it first fruits. And then the third month, there was a very brief time of Pentecost in month number 3. And then in the 7th month, he had those other feasts. I think they started with the blowing of the trumpets, and then the Day of Atonement, and then Tabernacles. So months 1, 3, and 7 were primary to God, and they're prime numbers. And God uses prime numbers. God's the inventor of mathematics. And there's only one God, and he's 3 in 1, and 7 is his complete work, and he's completing the work of salvation through all the work that he did, and he's bringing people to him completely, who, of course, the oracles of God are given to the Jews. You're going to have to believe this book at one time or another to get saved. We believe the new... Yes, brother. No. The first month starts in March. The third month will be 2 months later, and the 7th month will be... So it begins, yes, that's right. That would be Exodus chapter 12 and 13, where God told them this is the beginning of months for you. And he began with Passover in their first month called Abib, and their third month, 2 months later, March, April, May, sometime would be Sivan, and then somewhere in September. By the way, we call that month September. Does anybody know anything about prefixes and Septo is answer the phone. Septo means pick up the phone. That could be from the radio station. I called in today. They got $100 on the line here. Someone picked that up for me. No, September means 7th. What number month is that to Gentiles? 9. God married our Gentile calendar to theirs without us knowing it. We call the next one October. We call it the 10th. That means 8. We call November the 11th. That's 9. We call December the 12th, decade 10. That's so he married our calendar to those. We don't even recognize it, but one day he'll show us. Nonetheless, those feasts. So I got one in the first month, one in the third, one in the 7th, and I got a whole half of a year to wait before it starts again. So what God did in his goodness is when his people were finally dispersed from the land because of disobedience, God allowed 2 additional feasts to be birthed while they were out there in the dispersion time. During the times of the Gentiles, 2 extra feasts were birthed. Now, we know the first one. It's in the book of Esther. It's called the Feast of Purim, and you read about it in chapters 9, 10, 11, 12. And they were, of course, over there in the Persian captivity in Shushan, the palace, and there was Esther and Mordecai. And we've got the problem with Haman trying to oppress them, and God delivering his people in Esther and allowing them to have a feast of the celebration of deliverance during the times of the Gentiles. I mean, the real feast of deliverance. Left my water over there. The real feast of deliverance is Passover. And that's the one that God likes to celebrate, but he allowed his people to have another feast there, and that ended up being in month, I think, 12. That happened in about 500 BC. Well, what happened a little bit later, you're going to have to go now to Daniel chapter 11. They were still in a time of oppression by the Gentiles. And in Daniel chapter 11, one of the greatest prophecies ever written, very, very specific prophecy here. Now, I understand, you read Daniel, that the 11th chapter follows the 7th and the 8th and the 9th and the 10th chapter. And we know in the 7th chapter, God gave like a big prophetic picture of all the Gentile kingdoms going from the Babylons to the Persians to the Greeks to the Romans and the revived Rome. And he was just basically showing Daniel and maybe showing us that's going to be a long time before the Son comes back and takes the throne. I think what the Lord is permitting is 6 is the number of man, and he's going to allow man 6,000 years in his permission to rule the planet and then have a grading period and stand before God. And how exactly did you do? And in any nation or any century. And it's not going to work well. And we saw in the 7th chapter of Daniel that eventually the Son of Man will stand before the Ancient of Days, and God will give him the kingdom which shall never end. And that will be the final millennial, the 1,000-year period, the 7th grouping there, where Jesus runs as opposed to men, and he'll be able to then, when it's all done, they'll be able to compare. This is how Jesus runs things. This is how men have run things, and all the universe can decide who did the better job. We already know who's going to win that one. I mean, it's like, in the old days, I saw something recently that was, it was from a long time ago, black and white. It was a Sammy Davis was doing something, and then young Jerry Lewis wanted to get up and compete with Sammy Davis, and at the end, they would put their hands over both, and the audience would applaud. Well, it's hands down. Sammy Davis is going to win. I mean, Jerry Lewis is a comedian. They were trying to sing. Sammy could out-sing him. Sammy could out-dance him. Okay, that's how it's going to be. Jesus. Here's what the people have done. Who do you like? And everyone's going to like Jesus. And in these chapters here, as he's showing Daniel this period of captivity, so to speak, you hope that you would get the kingdom back. You hoped you would take over Jerusalem again. It's going to be much longer than you think. And he starts spelling out in the 11th chapter, in the first year of Darius the Mede. This is about 535 BC. He says, I, Daniel, I stood to confirm and strengthen him, and now I will show thee the truth. And now the angel speaking to him from the 10th chapter, who's Gabriel, is going to explain things to him that are going to happen in the next 500 years until the first coming of the Messiah. And it's an amazing prophecy here. And he goes through the first thing he says, behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. And so the Persians had just taken over, and he's letting them know there's going to be 3 more kings that are going to take over there. And it turns out, I got their names here somewhere. I wrote it down. Let me just find this. I know I did this. I typed it out. But I'm good at losing things. Ahasuerus. Yeah, if they got it there, then that's good. I'm glad they have it. I had it written down with the dates and everything, and I might have lost it so quickly because I'm good at doing that. But yes, 3 kings stood up. Excellent. And what they're going to do is the 4th one this is going to be the one during the time of Esther, is going to stir up his people against Grecia. And back in the book of Esther, chapter 1, the king had the big festival there. And in the next chapter, he was very depressed because he went out with his armies and he tried to go from Persia over to Greece in the west and to fight them. And they lost the battle and he came back upset and defeated. And they said, we got a good idea for him. Let's get a nice, beautiful girl to make you feel good. And they went out and found Esther for him. And so that happened. They stirred up against Grecia. They lost. And then he skips all of a sudden about 100 years or a century. God does this a lot. He just jumps around in time. In verse 3, and a mighty king shall stand up and rule with great dominion. He's talking about Alexander the Great. And about 100 century later, Alexander the Great's going to come along. And he was prophesied before in chapter 8, verse 21. The rough goat, the king of Grecia, the great horn, Alexander the Great, is going to come one day. You notice, I wish God would have named them all. But you notice he didn't. He doesn't name these people. Why? They don't know him. They're not written in the Lamb's book of life. And so for the most part, the Bible says the name of the wicked shall rot. I don't want to have all these rotten names in my book. So I'll describe them in a certain way. And as the period is coming, you who are living through it and go, oh, that's the one, the great horn. He calls himself Alexander the Great. That's what you're talking about, the king of Greece. And so what happens is historians study this and they can see who he's talking about. And it gets them angry that somehow this man, Daniel, could see all this happening. You're talking about Alexander the Great. It's 340 BC. This is being written in 530 BC. How could he know this? And then they say, well, Daniel obviously wasn't written by Daniel. It was written a long time afterwards by another man that put the name Daniel to it after it was all finished, because nobody can know history in advance. Well, God can, and that's what he's showing them right here. And Alexander the Great comes, and what's going to happen in verse 4, when he's broken, it'll be divided toward the four winds of heaven, just like it was told Daniel back in go back to Daniel 8 again, a little bit more specific there. And when the great horn of verse 21 is the first king, verse 22, and when he's broken, four will stand up for his kingdom, and four kingdoms will come out of it. That's exactly what happened. When Alexander the Great died, his four generals took over. And I think, I'm trying to get the names of them. There was Cassander, there was Lysimachus, there was Seleucus, and there was Ptolemy. Seleucus, the four winds of heaven, he took the northern part, where the northern winds were, in Syria. Lysimachus, Ptolemy took the southern part, down in Egypt. Lysimachus took the eastern part by Thrace and Lydia, and Cassander took the western part known as Macedonia. If you remember in your New Testament reading, the Macedonian call is where Paul was called to Macedonia, to go to Philippi. And that's Greece. At the time that Paul was writing, Greece was broken up into two portions. There was Macedonia on the north and Achaia on the south. And on the north, there was Philippi, the principal city, along with the Bereans up there. And in the south, there was Corinth. There was Thessalonica, and those cities were there. And anyways, Alexander's generals, they divided his kingdom into four parts. That's exactly what they did, just like it says here. Now, what happened then at that point is, sadly, there was about 230 years of war called the Syrian-Greco Wars, and they went back and forth. And you can read about this in Wikipedia. You can read about this in history books. God's not going to spend a lot of time with it, but he does tell you about the king of the south fighting the king of the north, and this guy fighting this guy. And basically, one of the sad truths of the history of mankind is men war a lot. Men kill a lot. It's part of the fallen nature. Like the Apostle James, where do these wars come from? Well, they come from within your members. I mean, you lust to have something, you can't obtain it, so you fight and you war. And that's what lost people do. That's why God is trying to show us there's no hope without the new birth. The old birth is corrupted and selfish and doesn't care about others. And so anyways, these wars are going on here. And he talks about the battle between, verse 5, the king of the south. Alexander's kingdom, Ptolemy, took the south. And he talks about him fighting in verse 6, at the end of many years, the king's daughter will come join the king of the north. That's Antiochus II. And he's up in Syria. And they're fighting back and forth. And they try some spy activities. The guy says, honey, why don't you marry that king there? He says, we're at war with them. No, but I'll tell you what, you go and make it look like we're having peace and get as much information as you can out of the palace and tell me about it. And so spying went on, the various things that people do. And they're fighting out of it. Verse 7, a branch out of her roots, one of her kids, Bernice's brother, stands up and fights with this one, and they're fighting back and forth. And you read about fighting all through here. Every one of these people, as you go through, whether it's Ptolemy Philoper of verse 10, whether it's Seleucus in verse 9, whether it's Antiochus Magus, the king of the north, in verse 13, whether it's the daughter of women in verse 17, that's Cleopatra. God doesn't give their names, but as they went through history, every one of these characters popped up in the newspaper. Look who's here in the New York Times in the fashion section. It's Cleopatra. It's the daughter of women. All these people came just as God predicted them here. And finally, what happened in verse 21, in the estate of Seleucus Philopator, who was the king of the Syrian kingdom. Now, when God says north and south, remember, God's eyes are on Israel. So the one north would be the Syrian kingdom above, and the one south, just as you drift here to the south, there's Egypt. And you wanted to get there, you had to go down through Israel to get to Egypt. And the Egyptians had to come up through Israel. They had the King's Highway, like they took on the Exodus. They were coming up the King's Highway to reach into Israel. And you could go right through Israel and go up to Syria. And they were trading routes. Got to remember, why did God put the temple in Israel? Because Israel, you've got Africa here, you've got Asia here, you've got Europe here, and it was kind of the hub. And if you wanted to trade in the old days before the Wright brothers invented the airplane, you did it on foot. And you did it with however you did it, and you had to go through the hub of the wheel. And God had put it right there so all these traveling merchants could come through, and the Midianites and all these people could come through, and they could see the true God as opposed to the fake gods that they had in their land. And it was God's way, before television, radio, of making sure that these people heard of the one true God. Does this make sense to all of you? Okay. God had a plan. His plan was that they would know him. And he wanted to make himself known, so he gave his, word to these people. Well, anyways, sadly, this lost king of the north and this lost king of the south, they're fighting and they're trampling on Israel. They keep going through the Holy Land and the Promised Land in their battle. And by the way, if we were having a war too, let's say we decided, America, we wanted to fight Russia. From our standpoint, would you like it on home turf? You want them here? No, you don't want that. Neither do the Russians. Let's fight in Germany. We'll go fight in neutral ground. That way, no matter who loses, at least our cities aren't broken up. Let their cities be broken up. And so the Syrians and the Egyptians are coming through here, and they're fighting in Israel. And verse 21, finally, when Seleucus Philopator died, a man took the throne, a vile person by the name of Antiochus IV. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, the illustrious man. He thought he was a very special kind of a person. Antiochus IV, king of the Seleucid Empire from 175 BC to 164 BC. About 11 years this man ruled. And his armies marched through Jerusalem on the way to Egypt. And they fought back and forth, and these kind of things happened. And finally, what happened to him, let me see if I got my notes right here. It's kind of tricky. We're in verse 21. Okay. Stands up a vile person, Antiochus Epiphanes. He takes the throne. He was 40 years old. He was experienced in politics because he had grown up in the palace, because that's usually how people grow up. If they're a prince, they grow up in the palace. He saw the kingdom of Syria was beginning to break up into factions, and it says here, he'll come in peaceably. And he immediately decided, I got to get these people back together. And the best way to get these people back together, let's hold these large banquets, opulent with the finest food and clothing and spice. And let's take some of the money that I have and let's scatter it to the people, and we'll buy their fellowship and people can be bought with money. And that's what he did. He came in peaceably, and he would walk. Sometimes he said, I'm going to take a walk down the streets of Antioch in Syria. And the kings didn't do that. And he would walk by and he'd throw some money to people. And they started, wow, this is a great man. This is a peaceful man. This is the kind of man we like. And he stole the hearts of the people. And it says there, he obtained the kingdom by flatteries. You guys are wonderful people. You Syrians are the best people. I'm all for the Syrians. I'm all for the Americans. I'm for the common man. I'm for the middle class. And that's how he began to work to bring people to his side. And it worked. Verse 22, and with the arms of a flood, they'll be overflown from before him and broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. As soon as he secured the throne, he built a coalition with men named Attalus and Eumenes, the kings of Pergamon, and the arms of a flood. And he got a whole bunch of people into an army, and together what they did is they went and they attacked the remaining Egyptian armies in a military onslaught. They flooded them overwhelmingly, and the Egyptians were defeated. They were broken. Yea, also the prince of the covenant, the rightful heir to the throne. Antiochus wasn't supposed to be on the throne. He obtained the throne by money and flattery. He bought the throne. And the rightful man who was supposed to have the covenant of the throne, named Demetrius, learned of it. And Antiochus pretended, I'm going to resign and let you have the throne. Verse 23, and they made a league. And he worked deceitfully. And Antiochus used deceit, and he became strong with a small people, and he enjoyed the support and the favor of the common man in Antioch. And verse 24, he entered peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province. And again, he went to the best places in Syria. He needed support. Sad thing about being a rulership, when you're at the top, there's always other people that want to snipe at you and take your position. That's part of the fallen nature. That's part of my fallen nature and yours. We don't like being told what to do, and we don't like rulers. We don't like Jesus Christ telling us what to do. Now, one of the things Jesus is going to be doing with us over the next 1,000 years is teaching us how to stay in line and stay where he puts us. But by nature, we're all ambitious. That's the fallen nature. And these people recognize, and if you are a leader over fallen people, you always have to be looking around. You've got to sleep with one eye open, and you have to do everything you can. Now, if you get the new birth and the Spirit of God, and he's able to put order in you, you can actually rest in the Lord, and you can rest in the position you are, and you'll be thankful for the position God gave you. I don't mean to go, you'll think about that for a while, but that's it. But this is the problem this guy had. He's dealing with fallen people, and he's got to use deceit. He has to make leagues. He has to become strong with small people. He needs everything he needs to keep his position, or it will fall. Without the Lord, everything falls. This is another lesson he's trying to teach us in history. Verse 24, and he'll enter peaceably on the fattest place of the province. He'll do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. So he goes to the fattest places, and he does what his fathers have not done. What has he done? He's going to forecast his devices against the stronghold. He made speeches. He reviewed the history of the awful Egyptians and their hostility toward the Syrian people. He's trying to recruit men for his next war, and he's trying to tell them, do you know what they did to us in the past? Do you know they had us as slaves? Can you believe us? Do you mean they used to lynch us on trees? And you start bringing up past history, something his fathers had never done. He's bringing all this stuff to get people angry about stuff that happened in the past. Really? Did that happen? You just give me a weapon. I'm going to go fight. And he's pulling this up, and he did this for a time, and it took 2 years years for him to build his army. And his manner of rule all of a sudden changed suddenly. He quit giving gifts and he started to rule by force. Verse 25, he stirred up his power. I'm trying to tell you how the devil's working. Antiochus is a picture of the Antichrist. He's going to come in peace and safety. He's going to come in by flattery. He's going to look by your friend. I'm your friend. Once he has your confidence, he's going to rule by force. The devil doesn't love people. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where the spirit of the devil is, there's bondage. I may welcome you in looking like I have your best interest at heart, looking like I'm going to give you liberty, but all of a sudden after 2 years you're in bondage and you can't get out of the thing. This new drug will make you feel better. It'll expand your mind. You'll love it. Okay? Bring it in. I've got some liberty. I've got some growth for you. The year of the expanding man. 2 years later, you're bound up in it and you can't get out of it and you're addicted. This is the way he works. Whether it's with drugs, whether it's with relationships, and God's painting it for you. This is what Antiochus Epiphanes, the illustrious Antiochus, did. And now what he did is, verse 25, he stirred up his power and his courage against the king of the south. I want Egypt. I want the wealth they have there. I'm lusting. I want more. I'm not satisfied with what God gave me. Syria is a beautiful land. Wouldn't it be enough just to be the king of Syria? Do you need to rule Egypt too? You know, I just want to tell you from the American standpoint, because I never was a ruler. I didn't have an army. But as I was working in the medical field and we began to put groups together, anesthesia groups, and we have let's say one anesthesia group finally has the, I don't know, what you call it, at a hospital. We have the rights at that hospital. Okay, and I remember we were working at Sisters Hospital, and what were we doing? I think 12,000 operations a year, our group. That's a lot of money. We got all the 12,000 operations at Sisters. I was pleased. There were other guys in my group. You know what we need to do? We need to take over Millard Fillmore. Why? Aren't we happy? Didn't that's enough here? What do we need to expand for? We got enough work right here. But there's something about certain people they want, and how much more? Just $1 more. They want more, and I don't know why it is. That's how he was. Now we're going for Egypt. It's not enough. Syria is not enough for me. I want Egypt too. And he stirs up his power against the king of the south. And he led a great army down through Israel to get to Egypt. And he attacked Ptolemy the fifth, Philometor, that was the guy's name at the time. The king of the south was stirred up to battle, end of verse 25, with a very great and a mighty army. And he shall not stand, for they'll forecast devices against him. And what happened is in this war, Antiochus couldn't stand. And what he had to do was he had to pull back and leave. And in verse 28, he'll return to his land. He got some riches along the way. On the way back, he stole some things. And he's on his way back. But when he came back to his land, the Jews were happy that he was finally gone. He's finally marched through Israel for the last time, and he headed back to his land. And a rumor started at that time that Antiochus was dying. And the Jews made great rejoicing over the rumor of his death. And this angered him, and he came back and determined to punish them. And it says, let's see, verse 28, and his heart is against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits. An exploit is a deed of great renown, a noble act, sometimes an act of great wickedness. And in 168 AD, he led his army back, not to Egypt, but into Israel against God's people. Now, I wouldn't have known any of this without some history books, and probably the best history books is this one right here. This is the complete works of Josephus. Josephus was born in the 1st century. That was when Jesus was. He was born about 10 years after Jesus died. A 1st century Jew. He was hired by the Romans. He was brilliant. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem And he said to the eunuch, find me some smart kids over there and bring them so I can use them at the palace. I mean, we always want the best of the best. Okay, Daniel, Mishael, Azariah, bring them here, and we'll use them at the palace. Well, the Romans, find me some smart Jews. And he came in, and he ended up being the historian for the Romans that lived in the first century. And he had permission by Caesar at the time, and whatever the Caesars were at the time, to go anywhere through the Roman Empire. Maybe he had an entourage with him, and they hear on the emperor's orders, and he could look and he could record anything. He was able to go into the temple because he was a Jew and write down the chronologies. Most of the stuff we know about the first century is from Josephus's writings. He has, let me see here, I'll just read to you. He's got 20 books on the Jewish antiquities. He's got 7 books on the Jewish wars. He lived during the takeover of the temple in 70 AD. He can give you the number of people that was killed, the number that were taken captive. It's all written in here. And his book also talks about what happened here when Antiochus went back with his armies. They killed 40,000 Jews in 168 BC. They took another 40,000 Jews captive, and they sold another 40,000 as slaves. They put them in the slave market. All right, let me just see. Now, the other thing he did, he commanded his troops, in addition to slaughtering the Jews, men, women, and children, he commanded, go to the temple. Now, this isn't the one Solomon built. This is the one that was built by Nehemiah afterwards, Ezra and Nehemiah. That was built around 500, 400 BC. This is now 160 BC. So he goes into that temple. He says, take all the gold you can out of it. Anything that's worthwhile, get. Take anything you can. And so they were taking a whole bunch of stuff. And he says, I want you to rededicate that temple as a shrine to my God. And since he was a Syrian Greek, I want it rededicated to Zeus. And he went in and he said, the Jews that live there now have to be, I want compulsory Hellenization. It's a big fancy word. It means they have to learn Greek language, they have to learn Greek religion, and they have to learn Greek customs. No more Jewish stuff. Okay, so this is what's happening in 167 BC. He had a Greek altar. He said, where's that brazen altar there where they do the lambs? Put a Greek altar over the top of it, and I want to replace the sacrifice with pigs. I want pigs on the altar there. So they put pigs on there. I want no more keeping of the Sabbath. No more Jewish festivals from Leviticus 23. You're going to celebrate our festivals. Compulsory Hellenization. Any Jew who refuses to follow or refuses to eat pork, or any Jew I find with a book of the law, I want him killed. The soldiers, I want you to burn any sacred scriptures you can find. This is all happening. And the soldiers of Antiochus passed like a searching fire, starting in Jerusalem from village to village. And they tried to end all the visible expression of Judaism, not only in Jerusalem, but all through the rest of Judea and other towns they could. The Jews were told, you must participate in the Greek worship. We have the Bacchanalia celebration. It's about the god Dionysia. We want you to take part. We want you to deck yourselves with the various things that we do, even if you're partially naked. Sing the wild songs. We want you to sing to the Greek goddess of winemaking. And we want ritual madness and religious ecstasy. And you have to do it. And many fled. And they went in the hidden caves. Some went in the mountain retreats. Some said, okay, we'll do it and figure, look, he's not going to live much longer. In 10 years, he'll be gone. We can go back to the old way. We'll put up with it for now. Jewish women, if they had their newborn son circumcised, they were to carry the baby. The soldier was to take them, put the baby in their arms, and throw them over the city wall to death. Remember when Judas, when he fell, he was hanging. I don't know if you know how Jerusalem is. There's an area here called the Valley of Hinnom, just outside the city to the south side. And the wall itself was about 100 feet high. And that valley is about 400 feet down. It's about a 500-foot drop. And they were throwing the women with the children to death. Now, the strange thing that was happening is a lot of the Jews fled. And many Jews fought back, and the Greeks and the Syrians were surprised at how strong they were in the Jewish faith. It's a funny thing about the Jews. If they themselves wanted to try it, that was different. But if you tried to force them, they fought back. And they were fighting back, and not for centuries had they been kind of such loyalty to, I mean, there's only a few Jews that went along and put up with what Antiochus was doing. And many Jews offered themselves to die, and Jewish martyrdom was occurring year after year, and it fills history books. There's 2 books you can read called 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And those are history books written around that time, kind of like Josephus. And you can actually read what happened. There's not much spiritual in them, but there's history, yes. Of course not. The Catholic Church starts about 600 years later, 400, 600 years later. We're talking about 160 BC. 160 BC. This is before Christ. Yeah. Josephus wrote this stuff afterwards because he was able to get his hands on everything those Jews wrote. Because anything they wrote, if they kept it in the hills and the caves with them, you're going to see when everything gets rededicated later and Jesus is there later, all these records are brought back into the temple, and he was able to get his hands on them before 70 AD. No, he was born about, I think, 40 AD. Yeah, he lived through the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, but he's got all that stuff written down. And it's accurate stuff, good stuff. And you'll see a lot of his stuff. He goes all the way back to 800 BC, and it lines up with what the Lord says in the Bible. Anyways, what happened was Judaism now is being intensified in resistance, and they're getting kind of a national pride back to fight. And what happened was the soldiers, as they drifted outside of Jerusalem, they went to a little area called Modin, which is northwest of Jerusalem. And they came in there and they said, look, these are the new rules that the boss has. I see you have a small synagogue here. I see you like to do some worship here. Everything has to be changed. And the officer, the Syrian Greek officer, assembled the villagers in Modin, and he said, these are the laws, and I want you, the priest, now, you're going to bow down to our laws. And the priest's name was a guy named Mattathias ben Johanan. And I want you to do the first sacrifice to our Greek God. And just like Moses, he threw a fit and killed that officer in the Syrian Greek army. And then one Jew said, I'll do it, and he killed him too. He said, we worship only the true God. And he said, whosoever is zealous for the law of Moses and supports the covenant we have, come with me. And after slaying the government official and that Jew, he went out into the fields, and he had 5 sons with him, older boys. Gadias, which is John, Matthias, which is Simon, Judas, which is known as the Maccabee, or the Hammer, he was the strongest boy, Eleazar, and Jonathan. And these 5 boys and their father went up there, and they began to amass a small resistance army like Simon the Zealot, and were zealous for the Jewish way of life. And in the wilderness, they began to build a guerrilla force of followers of other Jews. These Jews that are hiding, saying, come on, let's be men. Let's be men. Let's fight against this. And what they began to do is, little by little, through unexpected raids and night attacks, they drove those Syrians out. And after 3 years, they all fled back to Syria. And what they wanted to do at that time when the war was over is they went back to the Holy Temple, well, the one of Nehemiah and Ezra, but it's still the Holy Temple, and it's in Jerusalem, and their desire was to rededicate it, but it was a mess. The Syrians had done all kinds of damage. The holy articles were broken. Things were missing. So they spent time, just like, remember in the book of Chronicles when Josiah sent people to cleanse the temple? They went and they cleansed the temple. And when it was finally cleansed, they gathered everybody together to have called the Feast of the Dedication. And they were going to rededicate the temple. They said what we need to do is we need to light the golden menorah. Remember Leviticus chapter 24? Go to Leviticus 24. The father was a priest, and he had read the book of Leviticus, and he wanted things done the right way, according to the law. Leviticus chapter 24, verse 1, and the Lord spake to Moses, and he said, command the children of Israel that they bring unto thee pure oil olive, beaten for the light, and cause the lamps to burn continually. And so the golden candlestick that was inside there was meant to be lit and kept burning all the time. Never let it go out. Now, the only way it would go out is if it runs out of oil. So the priest's job was to refill it with the holy oil every day. The holy oil that was described to them in Exodus chapter 30, verse 25, where they were told, thou shalt make an oil of holy ointment. After the art of the apothecary, it shall be an holy anointing oil. Thou shalt anoint, and you can't make anything like it. It cannot be poured on men's flesh. And so they needed it, and they went into the temple. And it's 165 BC. The 3 years of war is over. We're going to light the golden menorah. And there was only one little vial of oil, enough to light the candlestick for 1 day. That's the flask was only big enough for a single day of lighting. And they prayed, and they lighted. And miraculously, the thing lasted for 8 days while the priests busily. It took about 7 days to make fresh oil, and they made the fresh oil that was the holy oil that could be used. And so they called this the Feast of the Dedication, the Festival of Lights, because it stayed lit for 8 days. We call it Hanukkah. Hanukkah means lights. And it's an 8-day festival, and it starts in their 9th month, called the month of Kislev. So it's after the 7th month, it's in the 9th month, and it starts on the 25th day of the 9th month. Now, the curious thing about it, it's not in the Old Testament. I mean, Purim is in the Old Testament. You can find it in the book of Esther. This one you can't find. You think it's just historical, doesn't mean anything. Go to John chapter 10. When you study John, great book, and you have the greatest portraits of Jesus Christ, and we learn 7 times with the 7 miracles, he says, I am, 7 times. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way and the truth and the life. I am the light of the world. He says those things. And there's 21 chapters, and he says 7 I ams. But there's only one chapter where he does it twice. John chapter 10. He uses 2 of the I ams in the 10th chapter. He tells them in verse 7, verily, verily, I say unto you, I am the door of the sheep. Verse 9, I am the door. And then in verse 11, I am the good shepherd. Verse 14, I am the good shepherd. This is the only chapter where he gives 2 of the I ams. It's like a bit of overload, a double portion. And then he says not only this in verse 16, and other sheep I have which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring. Okay, now, obviously, where is he? Let's see, verse 22. It was at Jerusalem, the feast of the dedication. It was the winter. It's Kislev the 25th. And here he is, and in the Feast of Dedication, he is celebrating and condoning the Feast of the Dedication. And at the Feast of the Dedication, he's saying, I am the door, and I am the good shepherd, and I have other sheep that are not of this flock. He's talking about us. I mean, the sheep of his flock, he's the shepherd of Israel. Those are the Jews. The other sheep, that's us. You do understand that, right? I mean, we're the New Testament sheep. Those are the Old Testament sheep. And he's telling them, I have my Old Testament sheep. I got some other New Testament sheep. And he's doing it right there at the Feast of Dedication. He's walking, it calls it, in the temple in Solomon's porch. They had finally built a porch outside of it and dedicated it to Solomon. But this was the temple of Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah. It was the second temple, not the first one. And he tells us in this chapter, he says, verse 27, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me, And I give unto them eternal life. They shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. My Father which gave them me is greater than all. No man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand. I and my Father are one. And he's celebrating the Feast of Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, the Feast of Lights right there at that particular time. So we've seen the history of Hanukkah, and now what we're seeing here is, and I got another sheet here, and I'm good at losing these things. I'll find it. Give me a second. And we're seeing the holiday being observed by the Lord in the wintertime on Kislev the 25th. Now, it turns out when they do that particular feast, they sing a song. And I had to find it in the book. This is a book written by a Jewish rabbi. It's called The Book of Why. Because, you know, if you're a Jewish kid and you go to the synagogue, there's a lot of things, and you might ask your mom or dad, why do they do this? Why do they do that? And a lot of people can't answer it, but in the Book of Why, he gives all the answers. And they say, why do we sing this song all the time? We don't know who the author is. It's called Maoz, M-A-O-Z, second word, T-Z-U-R. And we sing this song every time at the Feast of the Dedication. What is that song? What's it about? And he says, well, we do it with the Hebrew letters and the popular melody, and we do it in honor of, and he's thinking of back when they were delivered, but he says the Maoz means Rock of Ages. And that's what they're singing every time they're together. Now, here's what I think. So the holiday of Hanukkah is interesting. The hope of Hanukkah, to me, is the lights. And they have in the big candlestick, by the way, you remember the one God gave them had 7 lamps to it. It had the big one in the middle, and it had 3 on each side. What they did because of this miracle is they made it 9 for some reason. It only lasted 8 days. But I was looking at the calendar this particular year, and it's going to start at 6 o'clock on a Wednesday, and it's going to end on 6 o'clock the following week on a Thursday. And if you count Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it looks like 9. I mean, it's altogether 8 times 24, but because it bridges an extra 8, it's 9. And so they make their new candlestick with 9. To celebrate the Feast of Lights. And the one in the middle is called the servant lamp. The servant lamp. And they use that one, and you light that one. That's what they did the first time. And then that one lights all the others. The servant, Jesus, I came not to be ministered to, but to serve. I am the light, and I light the other ones. And they sing Rock of Ages while this is going on. And they don't even know what they're doing. Now, here's the thing that stunned me. Ordinarily, our calendars are a little amiss, and usually Hanukkah is about 2 weeks before Christmas. Have you ever had Jewish friends? This year, because it was a Jewish leap year, you know the Jews have a leap year? Every so often, they have a lunar calendar, and because of their lunar calendar, every so often the Jews have to add a 13th month. Every so often. And when they add that 13th month, the year becomes longer, but then it balances everything out. But when it becomes longer, their months get pushed back. And this year, Kislev the 25th, instead of being like on December the 8th, is December the 25th. This year, the Festival of Lights, Hanukkah, begins next Wednesday, a week from today, 6 o'clock, December 25th, is Kislev 25th, and the Feast of Dedication lasts for until January the 2nd. It bridges all the way from 24 to 25, and that's the Feast of Dedication this year. And the hope of Hanukkah is the servant lamp, the light, and the unity, and the song Rock of Ages. It's very interesting. So I'm thinking this is the only chapter with the double I am the door and I am the good shepherd. And my hope is this year and the Feast of Lights, the first time I've ever seen them line up together, First time I've ever seen him bridge and cross into a new year. I'm hoping this is going to be the time when we're going to see the light of the world, when the servant lamp is going to light our lights, when the door, I am the door, is going to be opened, and we're going to get a chance finally to see him. I'm excited about next week. I've never seen the 25th and the 25th line up like that. So it's exciting. But that's the Feast of Dedication. And I said, well, it's not in the Old Testament. Jesus said, but it's in the New. And I honored it. And so God now has 9 festivals rather than 7, and 9 is the picture of fruit. And through these festivals, we learn about the goodness of God. And it's a time for God's people to come together with praise and thanksgiving and song and excitement. I mean, who would you rather see than Jesus? So I just thought it was interesting this year. Next week on the 25th, when we're getting ready to celebrate what we think is the birth of the Christ, it's probably the coming spiritually, is the Feast of Dedication. Maybe we're going to get dedicated to the Lord next week sometime. I hope. Even so, come Lord Jesus. That's tonight's study. Hope it's a blessing.